All right, great. Well, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for screening your lovely films. And I'm just going to ask a handful of questions, and then we'll open up to the audience. I think it's fairly late, so we'll see how much energy you all have. So there are a lot of different questions that come up, and I definitely prepared maybe some more technical questions. But let me start with a very general question. When we were invited to propose for this PST initiative on art and science, we were asked pretty directly by Getty to address the question of what benefit, if any, does collaboration between artists and scientists offer, specifically for science? And I think that, in the art space, we tend to think a lot about, well, what would the benefit be for artists? But one of the things that really struck me about both of your films was that the art came from the science in a certain way, as opposed to perhaps the other way around. So I wonder, what are your thoughts, just to begin, on that question, that sort of fundamental question of the initiative, which is what is the benefit, if any, or what are the benefits that collaboration or looking at art and thinking about art and the way that artists view the world can actually help scientists do what they do?
Well, I think for me, it's the realization that I don't think either can provide the most complete picture of the world. And so that's the theme I sort of wanted to try to get out, is that, scientists have one way of looking at things, and artists may have a different way. And that I think, what we see, or I hope you see, is that, a lot of the so-called explanations of the science are just pieces of art that I found that was not designed to explain it, but I think potentially gives a different perspective on the science as well. And I think, in particular, in terms of communicating to the public, this idea that complicated scientific ideas that really are often couched in mathematics and terms that people don't understand, that this gives them a way of visualizing it that they may not have had before. So I think that was the motivation. There's also some very specific things where, it's much easier to say, okay, how artists have taken something from science and used it. The reverse is a little harder to see, but it's there as well. And so one of the examples is Santiago Ramon y Cajal, who was an artist, and he really is the first person who actually pictured the brain in a realistic way. And it's astonishing because he did it by hand. He looked through the microscope and he drew these things. Before Cajal, they really didn't have the concept of a neuron. It's hard for us to believe now, but they thought it was some sort of a fluid thing. And his illustrations really prompted this idea that there are these neurons and that they fire and they interact with synapses. And one other sort of funny little side note is that Salvador Dali, he apprenticed with Cajal in his dissection lab. So, there's the question, is that the origin of the slit eye? So I think that's one example, and, you might have some others.
Well, I think I agree with your documentary when you say it's purely about, not purely, but it's about imagination. It's about imagining things. It's about imagining what certain things could be like and look like and function like, and in searching for different ways of seeing and knowing the universe. I think that was very eloquently stated in your film. The only example that I can bring immediately to mind is how Robert Goddard, who is the father of rocket scientists, how, from what I understand, I could be wrong, but I remember reading that he would just devour science fiction, and he loved science fiction. And then he started dreaming about sending rockets to the moon. And, New York Times laughed at him, and then in 1969 they wrote him an apology, because that's when, the Americans landed on the moon. But I think it's this idea of, artists looking at new ways of interpreting and understanding the world. And I don't think that either one, I think just this idea of working in tandem is very, very important. And it's something that I wish academia would appreciate, especially, I'm a professor myself, and there's STEM and the arts, and they're always separated, but they really should be seen in tandem and appreciated for how they inform each other and feed each other.
I mean, another example, it's actually from an earlier film of mine called Particle Fever. And in Particle Fever, there was not a really good representation of the so-called standard model of particles. You have these various things. You have the bosons and the leptons and the forces, and they used to just do it as a graph in some sense, and it wasn't revealing, it wasn't interesting. And when we were making Particle Fever, my editor, Walter Murch, became obsessed with finding a representation that was that had some intrinsic connections and that demonstrated something a little bit better. And I remember he came into the edit room once and he said, "I've got an idea," and he basically had this circular idea, and with the Higgs at the center. A lot of physicists resisted that initially. I mean, they didn't resist the image, but they hadn't really focused on it. But what happened with our film was they discovered the Higgs, which we did not know was going to happen when we were filming. Once they did, it actually took Walter and I a year to refigure the film, but the Higgs was at the center, and so he came up with this image, this representation with the Higgs at the center, and it was completely adopted by the physics community. It gave them something. So from our artistic perspective of something that we needed narratively and wanted to think about that way, it actually became adopted, and it's still probably the most used representation of the standard model.
No worries. That's great. And I think, it's so helpful to think about how often complex scientific concepts are not very translatable to lay audiences, and artists have the capacity to, if not to understand at an expert level, perhaps to understand at a slightly more advanced level than the average member of the public, and then to be an interface between those levels of knowledge, to have comparable expertise in another area with a scientist that allows for freer flow of information. So following on that, my next question is, from an artistic perspective, how are you working with images such as those produced by electron or laser microscopy that are not being generated specifically for artistic purposes? And so I'm actually going to start with you, Kate, in the hope that you might tell us a little bit about the process of making your films and talk about this question of what some might call operative images in your work.
Okay, sure. I wish I had the same kind of technology that James Whitney and Larry Cuba had when they were making their films. But for Cosmos Obscura, it was interesting because I had my colleague who is a musician and she does electronic music. She approached me with her music and she said, "I think we should collaborate, and here's my music, let me know what kind of images come to mind." And so I was sitting up late one night and I was listening to her music and I was just kind of trolling YouTube to just kind of see if I could get any information from there, not information, but inspiration. And I came across the Voyager images, and somebody had assembled all of the images from the Voyager missions in this sequential, very fast, rapid-fire, frame-by-frame animation. And so I sent her the link, and I said, "You don't need me to do anything. I found it." and she writes back, and she's like, "No, Kate, I think you should do something." And so I said, "Okay." And so what I did was I basically just downloaded a lot of the photos that I could find of Voyager, but rather than being very literal, and saying, "Okay, here's Jupiter, here are their moons, here's Saturn, here's Neptune." Her music was so abstract, and so I just thought, that I should be abstracting the images as well. And I'm no scientist. In fact, I was telling Mark earlier that my first love was science. I even went to space camp when I was 10, but I just could not math. Math was the bane of my existence in high school. So I didn't become a scientist, unfortunately, but I still love it. I still read what I can understand as far as the scientists go, and so I've always been fascinated by astronomy and by space exploration, and been fascinated by quantum physics, and so I was basically just trying to abstract these images, breaking down the more macro into the micro, thinking about time and relativity, and how quantum physics is very unlike our physics here, in our world. And so it was just basically thinking about all of these ideas and trying to abstract the image accordingly. And so now I feel like I'm rambling, so I'm going to very discreetly.
No, I think that's great. Actually, it makes me think of a moment in your film when Richard Feynman says something like, nature's not classical, right? And this sort of schism between, which I think also relates a lot to the art and science question, right? Between the way that we look at the world from a classical physics perspective and this new emerging perspective that we have through quantum physics and quantum computing, that in many ways is so theoretical it might as well be art. So can you talk a little bit, perhaps for us, Mark, about integrating Kate's films and other artworks and art films particularly, or AI-generated art as well, into the film that you made?
Yeah, well, I mean, this was definitely an example of necessity becoming mother of invention. I first sort of got the initial funds to make this film right at the beginning of COVID. So I think traditionally the way I would have approached it is I would have gone out and started to do interviews and started to, talk to people and think that I'm going to sort of structure a narrative. But I couldn't. And so I had this vague idea of maybe trying to find works of art that would accompany it. And I had a vague idea that I was going to talk about this narrative. I mean, it was a sort of a very amazing project because I really had an unbelievable amount of freedom to do what I wanted, which is both fantastic and can be paralyzing. But I had this idea, I wanted to find things. So I hired two professors of experimental film. And we just worked for months, Gregory Zinman and Leo Goldsmith. And we worked for months. Basically, I would say, I would explain some science to them and say, I'm looking for things like this, and they would just start sending me links. That's how I got Kate, actually. We would meet once a week virtually, and I'd get these things. And so I started assembling the art before I had the story and the narrative. And then at a certain point, I looked back and we had a spreadsheet of like over 400 different works of artists. And so I still couldn't shoot. So then I said, okay, let me see if there's any way, what's the story going to be? And I wrote a rough draft of a script. And then I just recorded myself doing everything, just all the lines, because I still didn't have anything or anybody. And I hired an editor at the beginning to just see, is there anything there? And she put together a 15 or 20-minute piece. We had no idea what the film was going to be still. Is it a feature? Is it a short? Is it anything that holds together? And I'll say that Kate's image was one of the few things that was in at the beginning, and it's still in at the end. There's a lot of changes in the editing process, and that opening image for me was just right away, yes. I mean, it's sort of art and it's science. And so we did that, and amazingly people responded. And so then we started, working on it, and I started doing interviews and putting it together, and then it was a lot of refinement in terms of which artists and how it would work and what the structure is.
Great. So my next question is actually about the concept of tools. And I think, I'll preface by saying in the art science / art technology curatorial world, we talk a lot about this notion that comes from the Greeks of techne as human craft. And so techne can include technologies of any kind. It can be sewing, it can be weaving, it can be sculpture, it can be language, it can be computers, right? But it predates all of our contemporary technology as a concept. And I think when I hear the speakers in your film talk about tools, I hear them kind of espousing the same idea. But as a process-oriented person, I have to push back a little bit, because I do think that often when we're hearing from scientists and technologists, they do conflate tools, material, and process and output. And so, which they wouldn't do in a laboratory, but when we're talking about imaging or art, somehow it does often get conflated. So I wanted to pick it apart a little bit and ask you, because I thought this was such an interesting comment that, initially tools were part of nature. The implication of that is also, I think, initially human beings were part of nature. Human culture was part of nature. Human activity was part of nature. So my question is, when did we separate our tools and ourselves from the idea of nature, and why do we do it?
Well, that really does get to a very important theme for me of the film, and depending on the day and who I'm talking to, I sort of emphasize one or the other. But the really important for me, in some sense, aside from the fact that I'm talking about the fact that I think we need both artists and scientists to really understand nature. The really important point for me to get across was these so-called tools are not these alien things that just came down from the sky. We didn't just have computers that just came down fully formed. They are nature. And this idea that people think of technology and tools, and then there's nature and humans, I really wanted to try to dissolve that and get away from the idea that tools are something foreign. They are nature. I mean, as Balsley says, if you look at any technical thing, it's based on all this stuff that's in the dirt. I mean, basically, our tools are dirt. And so, in some sense, what I really wanted to emphasize was that in our ultimate goal to understand nature, we are using nature. We may call it tools, but it's all nature. Do you want to add?
Well, I don't know if I can follow that up. But you're talking about the separation of humans from nature, like how we're in the Anthropocene now, and we basically control our environment. Gosh, was it agriculture? Going as far back as agriculture, the agricultural revolution? It's an interesting question, because it really is fascinating, like how we've learned about the elements, we've learned about chemistry, we've learned about materiality, and how it can be used, for tools and now for technology. But yeah, it really is interesting. Like, are we still products of our environment, or do we control our environment, or have we been separated from our environment?
I mean, to me, there's a unity. I mean, that's in some sense what I'm trying to emphasize in the film, is that there's a unity between nature and tools and humans, and we are moving in that direction. We should be moving in that direction. And even, all the hullabaloo about AI, I mean, it really sort of exploded while I was making this, and for me, the film unintentionally, in my mind, had this different perspective that you don't look at AI as some tool that is going to, either destroy the universe or be the panacea for everything. It's the natural extension of our understanding of nature and our unification with the ideas of how the brain works, how biology works, to understand itself. It's using nature and understand itself in some sense.
So let me complicate that a little bit, because particularly at the end of the film, when you end up in the new and very exciting but also very mysterious world of quantum computing. Because what you describe as unity, to me that sounds very classical. Right? Classical physics is about finding the fundamental unity or the oneness of things or the unifying principle of everything. But quantum physics is about simultaneous opposites, probabilities. And one of the really fascinating things about quantum computing is that it potentially allows for multiple possibilities to be computed simultaneously. As I understand it, and I understand this only very slightly, the challenge comes with the information output, because in order for us to understand what the information is that the quantum system is generating, it ultimately must be flattened into one of many possible probabilities. And so only one output will be generated per inquiry. So it's hard for us even to perceive the realm of possibilities that's generated within quantum computing. But of course, that realm of possibility is generated out of a model that, as you say, derives itself from the organic world. In this case, how the brain processes information through neurons and synapses, where we can simultaneously be processing in multiple areas of the brain, and we can be experiencing things from an emotional and a somatic and a variety of different experiences. So my question here is, I'm sort of leading us into the AI question. And what I'm thinking about is, what I really loved was when, I think it was Dario Gil who was saying about the Glenn Gould variations, Goldberg variations, right? And so he talks about how Glenn Gould performs Goldberg variations twice, once in the 1950s, once in the 1980s, or records it twice. And the differences that are, in his words, everything. And to me, right, what's fascinating about that is that it's not the information architecture of the score of the Goldberg variations itself that creates the transcendent experience of artistry, but rather it is the musicians intervening 30 years of life experience and experience playing the music. And I think this brings us to the fundamental question of AI, which is AI always has the information, but it frequently lacks the contextual experience. And so I just wonder what your comments might be on that, because I think it's something that the film just begins to touch on, and is including, for example, works created with stable diffusion. But maybe if you have any comments on sort of the artistic potential of AI more broadly, but also maybe some of the challenges or the limitations that we see.
I mean, with regard to the Goldberg variations, I mean, I think that for me, the point that Dario is making is that, you know, this is essentially something that seems digital, okay? It's a score. As he says, it's the same notes, no matter who's performing it. In this case, you actually have the same performer, same instrument, which is a digital instrument, but that they're so different is about the human experience of this. And so this is something that Sarah Schwettman talks about, and it's an example, again, to your first question, is because she's saying what she is studying is how do we understand the way we experience things that are created artistically. And as she points out, the interesting thing is that you have the art, which is the Goldberg variations, and that trying to figure that out is guiding science to a certain extent, because as she says, our models of AI are based on the brain. AI and the brain, it's an interesting situation where AI is modeled on the brain, but it's actually become the best model for how the brain works. It has become its own sort of scientific model. And so as she says, the great thing with a computer from a research perspective is you can stop it at certain points, you know, like, oh, okay, at this point, when you heard this much music, when you heard this, what was the brain doing? What connections were being? At this point, you can do it, which, as she said, you can't do it with a human brain. So I think, you know, that the idea is that AI, from a scientist, can get guidance from the art in terms of trying to understand these things like sensation, like feeling, that we don't really have a handle on just in terms of the computing itself, if that makes any sense. I don't know.
Well, I think right now we're so early in, you know, it's very early, and it's scary. You know, a lot of people are frightened by this prospect of AI, especially artists and writers. But I don't think that this is going to be the doomsday that a lot of people think it is. I think that AI is going to be a tool. I think every time a new technology comes around, a lot of people get very, very unnerved, and well, this is going to upend everything. It's going to ruin the universe. It's going to, you know, destroy. It's the end of the world as we know it. But as we know, you know, it hasn't happened. I mean, like, sound didn't destroy cinema. Digital technology didn't destroy cinema. You know, artists are still working. And I think hopefully, I want to be optimistic that AI will be used as a tool. It won't replace humans. It won't replace the arts. I think that we are such naturally creative and inquisitive creatures that I don't think that we're going to hand over our creativity and our desire to explore and to create and to learn, and hand that over to a computer. I don't think that we're going to be willing to do that. I think questions of authenticity will be raised quite frequently, and I think authentic human art might even raise in value, but now I'm kind of veering off into economics and postmodernity, and it's a little late for me to go down these tangents. But I think it's an interesting question to see where AI is going to lead us, both in the science and also in the arts. I don't like what it's done to some of my students when they write papers with ChatGPT, but we won't go there.
Yeah, but I would say also, the interesting, in my mind, we're just seeing, a repetition of what Stan Vanderbeek says. Here's a hammer. Okay, now let's think of the computer as a hammer, but we don't know how to use it yet. AI, to me, is going to be a tool that can be used. One of the interesting things about AI that people complain about, there's so much about it hallucinates. And, from a scientific perspective or from an informational perspective, this is a disaster, right? Because it seems like it's inventing things. But for an artist, hallucination is the creative process. And so it's a very interesting thing that for normal people that want to, find facts, it's a terrible thing that AI seems to invent things. But in terms of creativity and the arts, well, what's the difference? An artist sitting and dreaming, and Rafik Anadol, he specifically calls his machines machine hallucinations. And so I think that's something that hasn't really been publicized so much, is that this bug that the normal world thinks is a bug, from an artistic and scientific imaginative perspective, is maybe not a bug.
I think that gives us a lot to chew on. And it is Art Fair Week, so I think, the economic questions are appropriate as well. I actually saw some very good art that was made with AI this week. That said, there are a lot of ethical questions we have to deal with around where the material is actually coming from that fills these databases, and how much of it is actually derived from people's own copyrighted works without permission, so that you're really not using an AI to generate your own material, but you're really using the AI that's giving you other people's material and calling it your material, which I think ethically artists want to avoid. Another thing that's happened with artists working with AI is, and I've experienced this as a writer who's also worked somewhat with AI in my work, is that those hallucinations, as you describe them, are quite grounded in the popular psyche, in what we as a community of internet-enabled people, I wouldn't say all human beings, I would say specifically internet-enabled people, are what we're putting in and what we're pulling out of the system colors everything. And it's one of the things that we credit with the large amount of bias in AI systems. So Rafik, for example, was talking earlier this week about working in the Amazon and actually collecting an entire data set, building a data set for an AI with a community of people who are not on the internet, for the particular interest of finding out whether they are going to create a different kind of data set. And so I just want to put it out there too, right, that AI is not neutral, because it is a tool that we create, right? I think it's very tied with our concerns about the Anthropocene more broadly. Human beings often identify our tools as being something neutral, but the way that we use them is not very sustainable. So with that, I wonder if anybody has any questions from the audience. I know it's really late. Please.
Thank you for putting that film together, David. It's fantastic to see all those extraordinary animations. To me, that was joy. I read your film primarily as a meditation on the concept of information and how information is used and instantiated, and the history of our thinking about information. But there is a huge omission in your film I want to have to ask you about. The original digital technology
I mean, there's obviously a lot of things I left out, but what guided me was was really guided by what was happening in the development of technology and choosing certain things that I thought would specifically tie to our understanding of nature making advances. So it was not so much about people, with exception of Shannon, of course, because, and Shannon is singular in my mind still, in terms of understanding what information is. But, it was, where did the idea of digital come from? And honestly,
Punch cards come from weaving.
pardon me?
Punch cards come from weaving.
Well, Shannon's wife, actually, Betty, really was a great weaver, and Shannon actually designed a loom. So he was very aware of it, but that didn't really, in terms of representing something that was an advance due to our understanding of nature, it didn't advance it that way. And so from my perspective, what guided it is, okay, the idea of something that's digital, and just the idea that it's, it could be something. And I don't get into how they were made initially, except that it was mechanical. So this is something, it's not even a particular person. Leibniz himself didn't even make a computer. It was just the idea of something digital. And I sort of jumped from that to the idea that the big step in digital computing was doing something electronic. Again, it's not necessarily male or female. It was the idea that we needed to understand electrons. We needed to understand glass so that we could make vacuum tubes. And then the next generation of advancement, which was tied to understanding of nature, was understanding the properties of silicon. So the things I chose to do were all based on further understanding of nature and how that was translated, with the exception of Shannon, who, as I say, was the theoretical component. So I wasn't consciously following particular people or a sex or anything like that, as much as what were the things in nature that allowed us to make a better tool. That was, so that was really sort of the guiding principle. And, with respect to weaving, yeah, it's sort of a very fascinating thing. And, but it didn't represent something for the story in terms of, it wasn't like we understood something more about nature that allowed us to make better tools to understand nature further. And that was sort of the simple criterion for me. I don't know if that answers it, but that's what sort of guided the story, was just what were the advances in nature that allowed us to move forward, and how we incorporate nature into the tools at each stage. Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of scary things. There's a lot of problems, existential questions that we have. I guess, and I think they're important. And I think with AI, there's a lot of moral issues. There's a lot of issues with, who gets, credit for certain things. What drives me, essentially, in everything is, and so I studied to be a physicist. I was a theoretical particle physicist. And why? Because I'm really just interested in how the world works at the most fundamental level. And that's what I wanted. In some sense, I wasn't interested in making a film that was just about technology or something. It was about the fact, for me, it was the realization that we have all these things, and what is it about? It's about trying to understand nature. And so the film, for me, is about how do we understand nature at its most basic level. There's a whole other issue that is what is the danger, what is the societal issues, very important. It's another film. I'm sure there's probably 100 films being made about the dangers of AI now. And I think that's a really important question. I mean, I'm not somebody who just says, oh yeah, we just do AI, forget about any consequences. No, I mean, I sit on both sides, because I look at it from a scientific perspective, but also as an artist myself too, trying to do things. So I think, if you're asking me in terms of what I was thinking with the film, the narrative was, what do we do to try to understand nature at its most fundamental level? That was sort of the driving thing. Again, and even in terms of the technology, it was, okay, what did we learn in nature that allowed us to use it to understand nature better? And, in the end, for me, quantum is the understanding that if you really want to understand things at the fundamental level, you want a machine, a tool that is a quantum system that is operating that way itself. So it's just, that was the overriding theme. Did that answer it, or? I mean, so.
Well, I want to thank everybody for being here. I want to thank our two filmmakers tonight for joining us, and I want to thank Adam and Janelle for having us. Thank you. And please come back. I guess you have one more week of programs. Is that right?
Yeah,
2 more weeks.
1 more week on the 7th, programs on the 7th and the 9th.
Great. So yes, please come back. Thank you all so much today.